This paper was presented at the JCT Traffic Signals Symposium 2023 in Nottingham, thanks to the support of AGD Systems, Inrix, Message Maker Displays, PTV Group, Simplify Systems, Smart Micro UK and TRL Software.
So yes, I'm here to talk to you about this rather interesting junction, which I've been heavily involved in for quite a few years now. I'm going to go a whistle-stop tour behind some of the background and some of the more interesting points later on. So here we are. We're back in December 2021, and the opening of the scheme after about 20 months of work of construction. And you see there are dignitaries, 2 MPs, and the construction team who are behind the scheme, and quite glowing reviews from 2 MPs saying how wonderful this new junction is. If we go back a couple of years prior to that, it wasn't always the case. When we first revealed the scheme, the public reception was very, very negative. Thought it was far too complicated, far too confusing. Local press there describing it as a candidate for the worst junction in the county, worst round in the county. So what changed between the first scheme publication and the scheme being opened? Well, it wasn't the scheme. The scheme we delivered was very similar to the first concepts we had. What changed was driver perception, people perception. I'll show you as I go through the presentation. So go back a bit further now, back to about 2012. Here's the original junction layout. 5-arm, rather compact junction, priority controlled, peak time queues, as you'll see, very, very long queues, and a fair amount of injury collisions, rather hated junction locally, and a lot of growth planned, about 30% traffic growth planned to 2035, so it's only going to get worse. 2012, we were just looking at a number of options, very heavily constrained at the time by the fact that we didn't have money funds to call upon, and pinch point funding was the main source, and we're looking at primarily work within the highway boundary with short delivery timescales and low costs. So a lot of schemes options were ruled out very quickly. Of those, we took 3 options to a vision model. Now these look, on face value, fairly good. Peak time delay reductions, healthy benefit cost ratios. There's a slight problem. None of them actually solve the queuing problem. So all that growth is going to come along and it's still going to sit in a long queue. Not as long as it would have been, but a long queue. We didn't feel like this was an appropriate solution, so we didn't put it forward at the time. Roll on 2014. A new start to emerge of a new pinch point fund. We called it the super pinch points for various reasons. It was going to unlock potentially some bigger opportunities, some bigger scheme options. And that funding is what we all know as the road investment strategy, the 5-year funding cycle that National Highways has. We also got fresh forecasts from the Northamptonshire Student Transport Model. And we started to look at these, so what is the real problem here? And you'll see here plotted out using the Lintic bandwidth mode to help visualize those flows. And you see some very interesting trends and patterns very quickly emerge. We've got very, very high flows on both the A45 and the A6 going through the junction, actually dominating the overall flows at this point. The natural conclusion will be, well, grey separate it, remove the conflict. In highways terms, a great solution, but in practice, we knew that the cost of that kind of scheme would be about £50 to £100 million. And what we'd done previously, the best benefits we'd like to get would be somewhere around £50 million. So we're not going to get a good return on our investment. We're not going to get a scheme that's going to attract funding, so we can't take that forward. Not to mention it'll have quite a big visual impact. A lot of blight on a very nice area with long, long views across the gently sloping valleys. So we had to put that one to bed. Next logical conclusion, well, flatten it down and do it at grade, do a throughabout. So we tested a number of throughabout options, in this case, taking the A45 through in both directions through the middle of the roundabout. And yeah, it had some potential there, but we constantly found that by doing that, we were compromising on either safety or capacity, because you can't coordinate both directions at the same time, because you're trying to get both exit links to go through the exit at the same time, I try to enter the junction from both directions at the same time as well. So we took a bit more of a step back. Let's look again at the topography of the site, the geography of the site. We identified these 2 plots shown in red. They seem to be quite low value plots. They're quite well landlocked in between the junction and existing development on the one side and a committed development on the other side, which has long since been now built. Surely these plots are low value. So we said, well, if we can use just these plots and constrain the scheme to the existing highway boundary and this land here, we can get a fairly low cost scheme and hopefully therefore a good return and a scheme that's going to stand up and get funding. That then led to developing a solution to, well, how do we use that space? Got the idea of putting a new link through there as an additional ring around the outside of the roundabout. This will collect the two southern arms, the A6 and the A5028, into a single point of entry into the signal system across the other three nodes. We tested this in live vision model, looking at a bit of a wider area, and showed that it had very, very good results. Really helped improve peak time performance, really reduced delays, and really got rid of a lot of the queues. Great, right, we have a potential viable solution now. But this wasn't the end of the design process by any means. We thought, well, okay, we've got a concept here, it works really, really well, but this is a confusing junction. How is it going to work when a driver first comes across this junction? How are they going to understand where to go, how to drive through? So we took a focus towards drivability. How do we make sure that drivers can get understanding of this junction? And our primary philosophy that we started out with was, we want to make sure as far as possible, any decision points are not in the complex area in the middle of the junction. People are making decisions as they approach the junction, get in the right lane, and then travel through and just follow the lanes through. So it's an easy cognitive process for the driver to follow. This meant, as far as possible, every exit from every approach had to have at least one or more dedicated lanes. So there was no lane switching, no lane changing about, no decision points. This led to a change in design. We originally had the A6 southbound, had a right turn lane that was shared traffic going into the local road, and therefore had a decision point at the start of the cut-through. We thought that was far too confusing for drivers to try and understand. Am I going to go right to the cut-through, or do I go around the outside? If they get it wrong, then they get confused, they're going to do silly manoeuvres, and then we have accidents and we have more congestion. So we changed it. That right turn lane now is only for the right turn, and it's guided positively into the cut-through, and therefore we don't have that confusion. We also had a good think about the cut-through itself. Naturally, it's curved because the existing alignment was a roundabout, and obviously that saves cost, but actually a lot of the benefits are keeping it as a curved cut-through. The cut-through provides a natural deflection with the curvature, helps reduce speeds, helps control driver behaviour, and therefore obviously helps improve safety. The curve also allows us to put the right turns, both from the north and from the east, to run through the roundabout, because the geometry and the angles fit quite nicely, and we can run them through. That means we don't create new conflict by having traffic passing the same point or same conflict traffic more than once. So it helps improve efficiency, and again, it helps reduce driver distances and helps improve ease of following. We also had a very, very strong focus on the signing. The first thing a driver sees is going to be the signing. So how to make sure a driver, when they first approach, understands what they're about to face. The design team spent a lot of time coming up with a number of different sign faces. There's only 4 shown there, there's a few more for each of the approaches. And these were shown to a panel of the design team, both client side and designer side. And they were shown completely cold, say, what's your reaction to this? How do you perceive this sign? Do you understand this? And that allows us to really understand at the bottom of which were the signs that will be the most easily understandable for a driver when they first see it for the first time and know what they're supposed to do. And if you're interested, it's the bottom far right one there, that's the one that we actually chose. Of course, it wouldn't be Signals Symposium if I don't talk a bit about signals and how they coordinate. Very briefly on here, we've now reduced this junction from effectively being a 5-arm. The signals are more or less a 4-arm. It's a 3-arm roundabout with a 3-stage, 4-stage node on one side. But it very much operates like a crossroads, 4-arm crossroads, with the A45 flows overlapping heavily in one direction and the right turn stacking on the island. Then the A6 flows and the flows from the local road going through together as well, in opposite directions, and again stacking the right turns on the roundabouts. It's a relatively simple operation, but because of the layout we've actually got a bit of flexibility and allows Mover to overlap different flows and change some of those parameters and respond to some of the traffic a bit more responsively. So now we've got a scheme. We've tested it. We've developed what we think is a fairly good solution. We've gone through all the appraisal and we've shown that actually, yes, we've got a fairly healthy scheme here. £20 million of cost and a BCR sitting just under the 3 range. Granted, that did drop by the time we did the final assessment, the final costs at the end of the scheme, and that's dropped to around about 2, but still a very good return for a scheme of that sort of value. But that's only part of the story, because we've got the scheme, we've got to get the public on board. As I said, when we first presented this to the public, there's a sample there, but there were many, many more. I could have put hundreds of different comments on there, people saying, don't like it. It's horrible. Why are you doing this monstrosity? And there are three main themes. The first and the third one on there are fairly easy to defend because we'd done the work, we'd proven that grey separation wasn't viable and that doing a small scheme just wouldn't solve the problem. But how do you get around the problem of it's too complex? You made it too difficult. No one's going to understand it. It's going to be a nightmare. We had two key things we did to this. The first one was we had a 3D model built of the entire scheme. We had a load of still images that we used throughout the publications, and we had a video. There's a very, very short clip of the video here, trying to show people what it is from a driver's perspective. We designed this junction to be visible from a driver's perspective, to be drivable. So we want to show people what they would experience, not on some fancy plan, but actually how they'll experience the junction as they approach it as a driver. This proved very effective. A lot of people saw a different understanding, different interpretation of the junction, and were much more comforted that actually this was something that they could drive, they could go through. Not everyone was convinced, and a lot of comments were still around, well, it's never going to work, it's all going to lock up, it's all going to, all the queues in the middle are going to lock up, block the junction, and nobody's going to go anywhere. So we also had the vision model, and rather than having a preset video of the vision model, we actually had the model as a pre-calculated animation file, which meant we could replay and curate what was shown to each customer. If you're interested in a stop line on one side of the junction, I can show you that. If you're interested in how these two stop lines coordinate, actually that. You don't know how long the queue is, I can show you that. And I can play, rewind, fast forward, and show people exactly what they want to see on the stand. And this proved invaluable. So many people had their views eased quite a lot, saying, oh, I can see you've done a lot of work and you've really assessed this and you've understood how it's going to work. Of course, there's always a few doubters, so you just can't convince. Hopefully they've now changed their mind. Roll on now to January last year. The scheme's been completely open, mover guys been out there, make sure mover set up and validated, and it's all working. And it was a joy to go onto all the public forums and see people's comments. And they love it. There's a few dissenters, of course, but by and large, people said, I drove through it, it's fantastic, it's amazing, it's really easy. And for me, that was a real good validation of what we set out to achieve. Here was on the face of it, rather complex design. We made it work, made it drivable, and it solved the problem. The queues are gone, people are much more comfortable driving the junction, and all those naysayers have gone quiet. Then what do we call this junction? It's rather unique. All this in the scheme called it a half-hamburger roundabout. Somebody yesterday referenced a hamburger roundabout as well, so it's a known term in the industry. But I think many of us would probably call it a throughabout. Probably more technical term most engineers would use. And early on the scheme, someone said, what's like a walnut whip? You've got to squint a bit to see that shape, to be fair, and it hasn't really stuck as a name, but I found it quite amusing anyway. And the public, of course, weighed in with their views. And my favourite one there is somebody who said their daughter likened it to a moon and a sun together. I thought that's a really apt description for a nice little unique name for our scheme. So there you have it. Scheme completed. Really great public reception for the final scheme. We won some hearts and minds in the process. I'm really proud of this scheme, really happy. So I'm going to let the video play. As we take some questions, you can just see how the junction ticks round. Now it's fully open.
Mark, thank you so much. 27 pages in the proceedings down to within the red light on the box. That's impressive, as is this scheme. And as Mark said, he's going to leave the video just ticking over while we do questions because I think there's a huge amount to assimilate there. So, from the floor, question. Paul told me as I walked past. So, Paul Hutton, please, and the mic's behind you.
Thank you very much. Really interesting, Mark, and I don't know if you were here for Rory Sutherland's speech, stream of consciousness, whatever you described yesterday's keynote address, where he made the point about public engagement, getting people educated, getting people understanding things, and pointed out that, there were failures in smart motorways, for example, but this seemed really impressive. And how important would you rate in the success of the whole scheme the public engagement that you really concentrated on and put a lot of effort into?
I think this scheme is an interesting one because this wasn't a scheme we had to put consultation on. It wasn't a formal orders process, nothing to go through. So you weren't obliged to any consultation, you weren't obliged to get public approval for this scheme. But we felt it was vitally important to get that engagement, to get that buy-in, because we didn't want to be heckled and hassled throughout the project with constant complaints and moans and so on. We wanted to get there in front and get people really on board with the project and get a real support to make sure that we would have a good engagement with the public. And that did help with some of the other issues we had later on. There was an issue with a tree that had to be taken down, and having that public support and engagement for the scheme in principle really helped us to be able to sell the issues and to work through that. So I think it was, for me, it was invaluable. I mean, I would do it again at a heartbeat.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Paul. Chris Kennett.
Thank you. One minor point, the furniture shop to the top right there isn't signposted off the main road. It got a little bit confusing just to find that one. But sorry, that was my first experience of this. My actual proper question, did you consider visual screening, such as planting early hedgerows? Because, I mean, having been a driver driving through this, yes, there's professional kind of interest, but also it's, at the moment, very big, very open. There's an awful lot of movement and poles and equipment and a lot of things going on. Did you consider site screening in order to sort of reduce the kind of visual complexity?
It wasn't an issue we identified, to be fair. It's an interesting point that you raise and something I have to think about. But there is planting planned for the middle of the roundabout, and obviously it's not matured yet in that picture, but there is some hedgerows on planted in there. But that was more from just an amenity point of view rather than a screening point of view. But it's a point worth considering down the line.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We've got one more at the back, and I think we'll make that the last one. The mic is on its way.
Thanks. Dominic Brown from Highways Magazine. I was interested whether National Highways ever do an analysis of sat-nav data and how a scheme like this changes people's behaviours and routes to work. Do you ever do that as part of the post-analysis?
Do you mean as in terms of them rerouting because they see it's easier?
Well, or either way, perhaps they reroute to avoid it, or they reroute because of it. It's just an interesting way of tracking induced demand on quite an interesting, complicated scheme.
In terms of the pre-scheme modelling, obviously we assess induced demand and rerouting, so we look at, from a predictive traffic modelling point of view in journey time, if we'd like to reroute to the junction, so that was all assessed right at the start. We haven't gone back and done any evaluations, and this scheme's only been in for just over a year now, so we haven't got enough data to really evaluate how it's performed since it's gone in. So we'll have to wait and see in time, but we seem to expect that this will attract traffic back to the A45 because it's now made what was a long 5-6 minute delay and is taking that down to next to nothing. So it should in theory, but yeah, we haven't done any evaluation of that on this case. Normally our POP evaluations will look at long term the impacts of those kind of things, look at flows and look at changes on a scheme by scheme basis as well.
That specific kind of sat-nav information, because obviously Professor David Metz, former scientific advisor at the DFT, he's pointed out that sat-nav throws up some interesting things for, say, smart motorways where people junction hop. Just wondering if that's kind of in your thinking.
Not explicitly that I'm aware of, I'm afraid, sorry. Yeah.
I've been passed a note that Margaret Bell would like to ask a question. The mic's coming, Margaret. Yep.
Really, just a quick question. The distance between those houses and the roundabouts reduced quite considerably.
Yes.
And I was just wondering if there was any backlash from that.
We had some very, very small noises. I mean, those houses were being built as we went through the whole development of this scheme, so they're very, very new houses. Most of the bought them probably in Weather, which was already planned at that point. But we have got a noise fence along that frontage, obviously, to help protect them from that noise. We did some of the complaints, particularly about visual impacts from some residents, both from the existing housing, top of the screen, and the other ones that you can't quite see off the side there. And again, the general thing was there's a short-term impact when we have to do some site clearance to get things in, but they will go back and it will restore that visual screening. So we haven't had any long-term complaints from any of the residents since it's been open. So that's good.
Thank you, Mark. I know there's another one at the back, but I'm ever so sorry. Could you come and talk to Mark during the coffee break? Thank you. Mark, thank you very much. Please, we show our appreciation for a very thorough paper.